Hear now these words, friends, from the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. Listen for the word of the Lord. This is the story of Pentecost. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place, and suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear each of us in our native language?" Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" But others sneered and said, "They are filled with new wine." But Peter, standing with the 11, raised his voice and addressed them, "Men of Judea and all who live in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and listen to what I say. Indeed, these are not drunk as you suppose, for it is only 9 o'clock in the morning. No, this is what was spoken through the prophet Joel. In the last days it will be, God declares, that I will pour out my Spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams. Even upon my slaves, both men and women, in those days I will pour out my Spirit, and they shall prophesy. And I will show portents in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's great and glorious day. Then everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God indeed. So many of you know this about me. I was a literature major in college, and I taught English for some time off and on. And occasionally people ask me, "Well, what is your favorite type of literature?" And my favorite type of literature is called the Bildungsroman. Has anybody heard of that? A few, yeah. It's English teachers, right? Yeah, we know. It's a coming-of-age story is essentially what it is. It's a form of literature. It's a novel. It tells how someone grows up, generally goes through adolescence, and comes to terms with life, right? Grows and matures and develops some skill or ability to make a difference in the world. Many of our common stories out there are coming-of-age stories, aren't there? And some of our most popular stories. Two of the most popular, movie franchises of all time, right? Star Wars started, the original trilogy was a Bildungsroman, a coming-of-age story of Luke, right? And the Harry Potter stories are coming-of-age stories of, Harry, Hermione, and Ron. If you're familiar with, you love the Harry Potter world, it is a Bildungsroman. Growth into maturity. Gaining wisdom. Seeing the fallibility of our heroes and our mentors. Rising to meet the challenges that face us in life. Learning to be less self-focused and self-centered. To appreciate that there are others in the world that we can serve and love. And it is an interesting practice, if you will, go with me here just momentarily, okay? To read the Bible in those terms. To read them as a growth narrative. to read it as a growth narrative, pardon me. And while the Bible is certainly not a novel, it's not a Bildungsroman, but we can see in it a story of God and humanity growing and learning in wisdom, we hope, over the years. And I do want to remind you that something that we talk about a lot here is the difference between salvation and sanctification, right? Salvation, we believe, happens once and for all in Jesus Christ. We're saved. But sanctification is a process where we learn and grow and mature throughout the rest of our lives until our glorification when we return to Christ in the church triumphant. Follow me, if you will, through a portion of the story of the Bible and see the growth and maturity that happens in the people of God. Adam and Eve. They live in the garden, they walk with God daily, but they disobey God, right? And so they're banished from the garden. And the people are scattered at Babel and wayward, and so we see Noah and the flood. With Abraham and Sarah, we get a promise, and then through one of their descendants, we get Moses, the prophet who delivers the people from bondage and slavery. Moses has an interesting experience of God, and God tries through all the stories of these people to interact with them, but they're only interested in so much of a relationship with God. Take Moses for an example. Moses meets with God in the midst of the people, but God is loud, the people find, and they prefer that God and Moses have their conversations up there on the mountain rather than in their midst. And so Moses does. And when he comes down from the mountain and his face shines, the people know that he's been talking with God. Elijah, too, the prophet, another great person of God, has an encounter with God on the mountaintop. You might recall his story. He hears God in the still small voice. But before the still small voice, there's a wind and an earthquake and a fire. Many generations later, Jesus would come to continue leading the people in the knowledge of righteousness and goodness and wisdom and love. And of course, to save us from ourselves. He too would go on top of a mountain to hear the voice of God and be transfigured into the image of God's Son, right? It's no coincidence that it's Moses and Elijah who meets him there. But what I want to point out with all of this is, in all of these things, God led God's people generally through one or two individuals who would go off and hear the word of God and come back, right, and deliver that word to the people. Usually, up until the passage we read today, God's Spirit, God's voice is heard, and God's Spirit is known by individuals. Until Acts chapter 2. Something dramatically new happens. And a people that were to be the light of all nations and lead all the peoples of the world in the ways of goodness and justice and righteousness and mercy and wisdom become empowered in a bold new way. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, I read a few moments ago, Acts 2, verse 2. That wind is the good and godly presence in the midst of the people. Coming upon them is the Spirit of God. Just like Moses on the mountaintop, just like Elijah on the mountaintop. But this time, it's not just one person who experiences God's Spirit. It's all the people gathered there to worship in the name of Jesus. It's the church. It's the church. And so when I talk about the Bible being a story of the hope of the people of God growing in maturity and strength and power. This is a big part of it. It's not on our own. It's through the wisdom, the teaching, the love of God, but it's also now through the power of the Holy Spirit that the church becomes the church. It is a radical thing that a group of people had the Spirit of God descend upon them in that way. And of course, we have the story that the tongues, and each one was speaking in a variety of languages at the same time, and we presume they were speaking, about the goodness of Jesus Christ and the gospel, and everyone was hearing it in their own native language. And of course, Peter explains it using words of the prophet Joel. His explaining it, by the way, was so that they would understand what was happening, but it was also to justify the moment, saying, no, look, God told us this would happen through the prophet Joel. This is indeed God's movement among us. And so where do we go with this? Well, we go several places. As a church now, we're empowered truly to be the salt and light that Jesus told us to be. We've been given a purpose to share that light with the world. We have this Spirit of Christ in our midst. Each of us experiences it in our own way, and then we gather together to understand it, to discern it, to interpret it, and to be the people who are empowered by it together to make more of a difference in the lives of our community and the world. We are the church. And as many have said, the Pentecost Sunday is the birthday of the church, and so we are grateful for that. We don't have a cake, but you can give blood when you're done worshiping today if you like. But we do have something else. We do have some purposes. The church doesn't exist for its own sake, right? It exists for our salvation, and it reminds us of that, and we're delighted in that, and for our sanctification as we grow in faith. But it exists for several reasons, and we in our tradition, the Presbyterian tradition, believe that there are 6 great ends or purposes of the church. And actually, we have 6 lovely banners in our narthex when you leave worship today that inspire and remind us of each of those purposes. In the next several weeks, I'll be highlighting one of those purposes in worship so that we can remind ourselves what we as the church are to be about, what we're to be doing, and the difference that we make in the world, and the difference God chooses to make in the world through God's people. Amen.